Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're at. I'm Jackie Lynch, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this session. In this session, we're going to be talking about the care and feeding of VIO servers. It's a three-part session, and in this first session, we're going to cover fundamentals before you start, some of the PowerVM 3.1 requisites, installation, and a number of things about maintenance and upgrades. There's also some supplementary material, which is a bunch of useful commands and links, etc., at the end of the presentation. So let's look at some of the fundamentals before you start. Any of you that have been to a presentation that I've given before know that I talk a lot about staying current. And if you look at this chart, which is from the IBM Flirt Lite tables, you'll see why. Right now, any VIO level prior to version 3 has gone out of support. At this point in time, it's actually really important that you do the migration to version 3. This here is just an indication from IBM of the life of the various service levels. And remember that version 3 is the new one that is AIX version 7.2 based. So 3.1 came out in 2018, then it came out immediately with a mini pack. Then there have been various releases until 3.1.1.25, which came out on July 17th, 2020. You actually have a couple of options which are very nice. One is that you can install directly from the flash image that you can download from ESS. What's nice about that is you get the latest level. If you want to download the 2 DVD set, then you actually end up installing 3.1.1.21, and then you can upgrade using the flash copy to 3.1.1.25. But one of the first things you should do if you plan to use NIM is you should upgrade your NIM server to the very latest, which is 7.2.4.2, and then it has a end piece which is -2028. That's required in order to be able to back up and restore your VIO server from NIM. I also highly recommend that when you're installing a new power server, one of the most important things you can do is read the technical overview red book and make sure that the VIO server level and HMC level and operating system levels that you plan to install are actually supported. We've had a lot of instances where people have installed back level versions of something that are not supported on the hardware, and you tend to run into a lot of problems when that happens. So how do we check those prereqs? Well, one of the best ways is to use the fixed level recommendation tool, or FLIRT. And you'll find there's 3 pages that are very useful. The VIO server to NIM master mapping, although it's a little out of date, going into Flirt Lite or the Flirt homepage and putting in all the information so that you end up being able to look at what levels you're actually going to be installing. Now let's talk about some of the prerequisites for PowerVM. So the minimum NIM master level I already mentioned, and for 3.1.1.25 it's not on there, but it is AIX 7.2 technology level 4, the very latest SP2. And some of the changes that come in with 3.1, basically this is the move to AIX 7.2. All previous version 2.2 VIO servers were actually running AIX to 6.1. Since that's been out of support for a while, it makes a lot of sense to move to 7.2. As part of this, they got rid of a whole lot of old stuff that we don't want to use. They also removed the ability to use IVM, so you now actually have to have a proper VIO server that's separate, which usually implies that, well, if you want to run dual VIOs, you're going to have an HMC as well. They changed the database, they did some enhancements to multipathing, and they added a lot of support for iSCSI. Another thing to note is that the old Javas that we used to have, Java 6 and Java 7, once you get to 3.1.0.20, you don't need Java 6 or Java 7, and you can uninstall those. So a lot of good things happened in VIO Server 3.1 in terms of cleaning up. So what are the prerequisites? You're really going to need at least a core and 8 gig of memory, and if you're doing shared storage pools, it's more like 16 gig of memory. The more high performance cards that you add, think 8, 16, 32, 10 gig, all those high performance cards, the more core and memory that you'll need. They always say you need 30 gig for root VG. I use 100 gig because I tend to add some custom file systems. I make sure my VIO servers are logging, etc., etc. And you have to have an extra disk. Whether you are using root VG mirroring, whether you're booting from SAN, However you're doing it, you have got to have an extra disk, and if you're mirroring 2 disks, in order to take an alternate disk copy, because one of the first steps of the upgrade to version 3.1 is that it takes an alternate disk copy. If you don't have an extra disk, then you need to add one. I usually on my VIO servers actually have a 3rd disk that I use for file-backed optical. I don't like having my file-backed optical in root-vg. It can make for some large backups. I already mentioned the NIM master levels. Keep in mind that there are some prerequisites for the HMC versions, and that version 3.1 of the PowerVM only supports the Power 7 Plus D models and above. It does not support any of the blades. Once you get to version 22630 of the VIO server, you can actually use the viosupgrade command on the VIO server to do the upgrade. But with shared storage pools, you have to be at 22632 or higher. I actually bring all my VIO servers up to 22632, let them sit for a week, make sure there's no problems, and I do the upgrade from 22632. And using that strategy, I have yet to have a failure. They've all gone through smoothly. You can install from the flash drive. These are some points that Nigel had raised about using shared storage pools. The comment that I'll make is that you really need to pay attention in the readmes for the upgrades for the rules around what you have to do in order to be able to upgrade your VIO server when you're using shared storage pools. And Nigel has published many videos and lots of blog entries, etc. on this, so I highly recommend that you go to his AI Expert blog or his YouTube channel to delve further into this. So here are some general tips. Keep it simple. People like to overcomplicate things. There are a lot of things you can do on your VIO server that you don't need to do. One of the things you do have to do is to make sure that your logical memory block size, which we sometimes see referred to as the MRO size or the region size, if you want to use LPM, it has to be the same on all the servers. I always use hot pluggable adapters rather than built-in ones. Again, I try to architect for LPM even if I'm never planning to use it, so that I don't run into problems later. I also set all of the adapters as desired. I never set any adapter anywhere to required. The reason for that is if it's a hot plug adapter and it's desired, I can replace it. I can also use it with LPM. If I have it set to required, I have a problem. It is really important that when you define the trunk adapters, they have to match in terms of the VLANs. You can't have one VIO server have one set of VLANs on an SEA and a second VIO server have a different set of VLANs on the same SEA. That second VIO server won't boot if they don't match. And I've run into this multiple times. I don't like mixing multipath drivers on HBAs. I also don't mix tape and disk on HBAs. One of my favorite tools, you'll have heard me refer to it before, is the HMC scanner. And I also use sysplan. I run those before and after all changes. I want to point out that I talked about staying current. It's really important that you plan for at least one update per year. I was working on VIO servers recently that hadn't been rebooted for 700 days. That's actually very scary because you have no idea if they're actually going to reboot. So that's also one of my other tips. Before you make any changes, rewrite the boot image, rewrite the boot list, reboot the VIOs. Once you're comfortable that there's no problems with them, that's when you would move forward. You have a lot of options with VIO servers. You can separate them for production, you can separate network from storage, but the main recommendation is to have at least 2 so that you can use dual VIO and do concurrent updates. And you should also test your failover, like SEA failover, etc., before you go production. It's very important that you use the VIO commands wherever possible. It's very easy to go into OEM setup env, become root, go into SMIT, and do whatever it is you want to do. You should only use that for things that you have to. Otherwise, you will run into problems. As an example, when you're putting on updates, you do not want to do SMIT to do your updates. Those should absolutely be done using the update iOS command. If you're running on internal disk, your root VG should be mirrored. If you're running on the SAN, your root VG does not need to be mirrored because the SAN should be rated anyway, but you still want to have that spare disk, or in the case of a mirrored root VG, 2 spare disks to use for cloning. When I go to do updates, I take my mksysb. I also immediately take a clone to using alt disk copy so that I have a very fast failback, which is a reboot from the other disk, and in a real disaster I can restore from the mksysb. By default, when the VIO server is installed, and you'll see this with 3.1, it comes up with 2 page spaces on the same LUN. One of them's 512 meg and the other one's 1.5 gig, and it's not active. So really you only have 512 meg page space. One of the first things I do after I bring a VIO server up is I remove paging 00 and I make HD6 at least 4 gig. I also add logging, I set up my dump devices properly, and I make sure that I check ERRPT regularly. If you've got errors on your VIO, those need to be fixed immediately. And then a couple of final tips. You never run at 100% entitlement. You need to make sure that the entitlement is high enough to be able to run the workload most of the time. The reason for that is that your shared Ethernet adapter and your network performance scales by entitlement, not by the number of VPs or CPUs that are available. So you need to make sure that you give your VIO servers enough gas. And then the last thing, which I see people forget all the time, is to back up regularly. You need to back up your HMC, you need to back up your VIO servers, just like you need to back up your data and your client LPARs. You can use NIM, you can script it, however you want to do it, but you need to make sure you do the backups. And now just a couple of things about sizing your VIO. For a small environment, I will normally start with a half core of entitlement and a minimum of 4 gig. I actually tend to go with 8 gig nowadays just because of the high performance adapters. And if I can do it, I actually try to plan for a full core minimum per VIO. Again, the more high performance adapters, the more virtual fiber clients, and the more clients that you're trying to support, then you may need more memory and you may need more cores. And so that's one of the reasons you have to monitor it. You want to look at adapter placement. All the adapter slots on your server have different priorities. So from a performance perspective, you want to look in the red books for each server and figure out the best place for you to put those adapters. Now, in terms of memory overhead, you need to add 512 meg for every active high performance adapter port, whether it's MPIV or vSCSI. If that port's got something plugged in and you're using it, you need to add 512 meg. Plus, for every virtual fiber client, so think of it as the VFC map that you're doing for MPIV, you're going to add 140 meg for every one of those. That's sort of the minimum memory overhead. Now, vSCSI is going to use more CPU in the VIO server than MPIV, but MPIV, of course, is going to use more memory. When you're doing your architecture, make sure that the planning for the memory and everything includes enough for the VIO servers to grow if they need to. That leads to a tip on server memory. When you get a system that has 256 gig or 512 gig of memory, not all of that memory is going to be available to you. And one of the reasons for that is that for every LPAR, it needs to create a hypervisor page table. And that hypervisor page table size needs to be able to handle the maximum amount of memory that that LPAR might grow to. So what happens is it takes this maximum memory setting and it divides it up, and then it takes that amount of memory and reserves it for the hypervisor table. You can see here is that even though these LPARs are small, somebody reserved 100 gig of memory. So when the division is done, there's actually going to be a bunch of memory that's held for page tables that will never be used, because you're not going to grow that LPAR from 5 gig to 100 gig. So you want to apply some common sense to it. And where this will manifest itself and you will see it is if you run the HMC scanner and you scroll over, you'll see firmware gigabytes. And you can see that for the server at the top, it's 5.75 gig. For the server down the bottom, I've got one that's 23 gig and one that's 38.5. And the interesting thing about those two systems is they're pretty close to configured the same. The big issue was that one of them had a lot more maximum memory settings. So run the HMC scanner, have a look, and then go back in and make sure that you do not over assign your maximum memory settings. Okay, at this point we're going to move on and we're going to talk more about installation and upgrades. Step one, whether you're doing an upgrade or whether you're doing an install, is to go and get the files. Now, in order to get the base files, which is going to be the 31120 ISO images, which is the 2 DVD set, or to get the flash image, which is a single ISO image that's at 31125, you need to go to ESS, which is IBM's entitled software site. And you have to have a login. You'll need to know the serial number of your system. And once you go there, you'll see that there are 3 images to be downloaded. As of September 23rd, there were the 2 DVDs, which were at 31120, and then the flash image. I always download all 3, but the one that I use is the flash image because I don't see the point in going to 31120 and then upgrading to 31125 when I can just go straight to 31125. So those are the 3 files that I download. And then I look at my install options, and what am I doing? Am I doing a fresh install? Am I doing an upgrade? Do I have a NIM server in the mix? Those are things that are important. If it's a fresh install on a new server, then it's pretty straightforward to do. You can install from DVD or USB, you can install from NIM. If it's an upgrade of a current server, then I'm going to either want to LPM off all the LPARs if I'm really paranoid, and then upgrade everything, or I can use the VIO server VIOS upgrade to upgrade it on an alternate disk. There's a number of different options that I have. My preferred method for the upgrades has been on the VIO server itself to use the VIOS upgrade. Now on NIM there's a VIOS upgrade command as well. It has different syntax to what it has on the VIO server, and it works differently. I prefer to use the one on the VIO, but it's up to you which one you want to use. If you're doing a fresh install, there are some things to think about. Number one, it's no different than any other VIO server fresh install. You're basically installing from the media or from NIM onto the hard drives, and then you're going to do whatever it is you normally do to customize your VIO servers. If you're replacing a current VIO server, you should be using viosbr to back up your metadata and copy those files to a remote system. That way, if something happens, you know how it was configured. I'm big on documentation anyway. I have huge spreadsheets for everything I install so that I know all of my MPIV, all of my make commands, everything that I do, particularly around the SEAs, I have all that documented. And as I mentioned, if you can use the flash image, that's great. One of the things, if you're going to use NIM, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, you have to pull the mksysb image out of the ISOs. Obviously, before you do any of this, you're going to go through check for compatibility with the HMC, etc. And my normal thing is I upgrade the HMC, I upgrade firmware, I upgrade my VIO servers. But right now, one of the things you need to be aware of is that for Power 9, if you are going to firmware 940 or 941, then you need to make sure that your I/O adapters are up to date on firmware before you put the firmware on. There's a big red flash in both of the readmes for those. So please make sure that you get your I/O adapters, and I'm specifically talking about your fiber adapters, but you should do your network ones as well, updated before you upgrade your firmware to 940 or 941. So backing up your virtual definitions, you can check whether they're getting backed up by running an ls on /home padmin config backups. And you can see here I have a bunch of them that are whatever, my VIO server.01 through 7. That's because I ran a command to just back it up every day and keep the last 7 copies. And that's what the command is down the bottom of the page here. This viosbr backup file, VIOS name frequency. So it's basically saying take a backup every day and keep the last 7 copies. And you can check, once you go into OEM setup env, you can run the crontab-l command, and you should see the cron entry is what causes it to take the upgrade backup. Prior to the installation or upgrade, you're going to back up anything outside of root-vg because everything is going to be replaced. If you have a file-backed optical library in your root-vg, it will get deleted during the upgrade. Now, it will still be on the original copy, so you can always wake that copy up and copy them back across, but just be aware that anything in root-vg is going to be replaced because basically we're doing a brand new AIX7 install on the alternate copy, and then we're turning it into a VIO server. If you are using logical volumes for clients, the viosbr command does not back them up, and the vios upgrade command does not copy them. So you need to make sure that you back those up. They should not be in root-vg anyway, but if they are in root-vg, you need to move them to a different volume group. A number of ways that you can do that. There's a link here that talks about how to migrate them and how to use copy-lv to copy them after the migration. And obviously you want to back up the VIO itself. In the case that I've got here, I usually take 2 backups, and the first backup is where I'm taking a VIO backup to the NIM server. The second backup is where I'm actually taking a mksysb backup. The NIM server backup is the one that I use that basically allows me to load the image to the HMC and restore from there. And the second backup, which is a pure mksysb, I can use within NIM to actually do a NIM restore. One of the things that I've found is if I'm upgrading current VIO servers, yes, we have SCA failover and it will fail-over, but I actually like to force the failover when I'm working on the primary. When I'm ready to actually reboot the primary, or if I'm putting IO firmware maintenance on the primary, then one of the things that I will do is I'll change the SCA into standby mode. And then I'll run ERRPT on both VIOs, and what I should see is that the secondary becomes the primary, and what was the primary is now the backup. And then when I'm done with all my updates and I've rebooted my VIO server, I switch it back to auto mode and make sure that it comes back as the primary. And what I found is that by doing it this way, it's a much quicker failover. Another couple of notes is that when you're doing installs and restores, you can't install actually any server, VIO, AIX, from the HMC or from NIM if the network is aggregated. Network installs are only supported over an access port connection. So you have a couple of options. One is initially to get access ports and then change them over later on to aggregates, or to take one of the ports on the card and just have it be a permanent administration access port that you use for doing maintenance. So that's something you need to think through. Now when you're doing a complete install, you can do it from NIM, you could do it from the HMC, you could do it from a mksysb, or you can just do it by plugging in the DVD or the USB. I've had success with all of those, and I've had problems with all of those. So I usually start with uploading it to the HMC, trying it from there, and that's when I find out if there's any network issues. And then my last resort is always installing it from the DVD, because that's always really slow. So something to note with the new Power 9s and the new HMCs, they do not come with a DVD. So my recommendation to you is spend the small amount of money they ask for and buy the external DVD, because at some point you're going to need it. Here's how we import the VIO server images to the HMC. Basically, I have the ISO images on my desktop. I go into the HMC and I go into the image repository. I tell it that I'm going to import a new VIO server image. Actually, in this case, I had put it on my NIM server, so I did a remote SFTP to my NIM server, pointed it at the images, and in this case I actually just used the flash image. Now you can see at the last one that I now have a VIOS 31125 image that I can use. I've mentioned a couple of times using the VIO servers with NIM. You can use NIM to backup, install and update your VIO servers. For installs with NIM, you need to create the spot resource from the mksysb that comes on the ISO. You cannot ever create a spot for a VIO server from an LPP source. That's basically an AIX install, and that's not what your VIO server is. You need to make sure that your NIM master's at the right level, and for 31125 it's actually 7.2.4.2. And then you can use the VIOS upgrade and alternate disk mode to update the server to an alternate disk. One of the other things that you should know is, because you have to extract that mksysb, you're going to have to upload the flash ISO to your server, and you're going to have to pull the mksysb out of it. Well, normally what we'd do is we'd upload the ISO image and we do a loop mount. It turns out that if you are using the flash image, you have to mount it as UDFS, not CDRFS, which is what we would normally use. So that's the only thing that one thing you'll need to be aware of when you're working with that image. And there's a nice link here on using NIM with the VIO servers. This is pretty standard stuff. You're going to add your VIO server partition as a NIM client, which also speaks to the fact that your NIM server needs to be standalone. It needs to have its own network card and its own SAN card, because if it's going to back up and restore VIO servers, it can't be depending upon them. So we're going to copy the flash image, the mksysb image from the CD to the NIM master, and basically we extract it from the ISO image. Now, one of the reasons I like using the flash image versus the ISO images, apart from the fact that the ISO images that come in the 2 DVD set are slightly back level, in order to use those ISO images, I have to copy 3 mksysb images and concatenate them into one. And I've had that work, and a couple of times I broke things. On the flash image, there's just the one mksysb image, so I just use that, and it has everything that I need. You do the normal things you would do with NIM. Define your mksysb resource to the NIM master. You define the spot on the NIM master, and the source for that spot is going to be that mksysb image that you just created. So there's an example here, and this one's doing it for 31021, but you would do the same for 31125. So I'm pointing it at the mksysb, I'm telling it to put the spot into NIM spot, and I'm giving it a name, and then I check it. You also need to copy the bosinst data file from the DVD and create, or the flash image, and create a VIOS bosinst resource. And you then allocate the mksysb spot and bosinst resources to the VIO LPAR and tell it to do a boss install from mksysb. And then once it boots, you go through the standard things of a new VIO server install, such as creating a password, etc., etc. Now, if your server has a split backplane, one of your options is to install one VIO server, and then you can clone it to install a second. I don't normally recommend that, but I have had occasions where I've had to do that. Basically, I make sure the disks are split across the backplane and that I assign them all to VIO1. I put all the disks into VIO1 with their adapters. I install VIO1 on HDisk 0, however I want to install it. And then I clone it using Alt-Disk Copy to HDisk 2, which is on the other side of the backplane. I remove all the disks and I get rid of those adapters. I then bring VIO1 down, remove the adapters, etc. from the profile on VIO1, and then I activate VIO2, and then I have to do some cleanup work. It's a little faster once you get the hang of the cleanup work than actually doing an install, but there are times when you may have to do this, so that's the only reason I'm bringing it up. So the cleanup you have to do is you've got to stop RSCT and do this cleanup here for RMC. If you don't go through these steps, what will happen is if VIO1 is running and you boot VIO2, you will lose RMC connectivity on VIO1, but VIO2 will look fine. If you then bring reboot VIO1, you'll lose it on VIO2, and VIO1 will look fine. So this is really important that you go through and you take care of the cluster and the ODM delete, etc. And by the way, this is quite often the way that you recover when you have RMC issues anyway. And then you have to go through on the second VIO, because it's a clone, and remove all the VIO1 resources. And they'll be a little different, but you'll get the hang of it because you just look for devices that are showing as defined, that are fiber adapters, network adapters, or HDisks. Don't go deleting everything that's defined, because there are some things that show as defined on a VIO server. Since VIO3 came out in 2018, a significant amount of what I've been working on has actually been VIO server upgrades. Obviously, with version 2 going out of support, people became very focused on let's get to version 3 where we're fully supported. So there are some things you need to think about when you want to upgrade your VIO servers. The first thing is to make sure that if you're using file-backed optical, that you run ls-vopt and you make sure that nobody's using the fiber optical devices. Also run ls-rep. Those are both padmin commands. If you are using NPIV to provide tape drives to clients, you need to make sure nobody is using them. And in the case of IBMI, you need to make sure that those tape drives are not activated on those IBMI LPARs. As I said, typically I upgrade the HMC and then the firmware, and then the VIO server, and then AIX and other operating systems. But you do need to check the READMEs, because sometimes there's a minimum level required. And as I mentioned, in the case of the Power 9, firmware 940 does require a specific HMC version, and it requires that all the IO adapters be updated. And with firmware 941, which is on the new G models, I actually had a situation where LPARs would not boot if I did not update the IO adapters. So you download the updates, you cross-check compatibility with FLIRT, you're going to run ERRPT, because if you have problems on the system, you should check those before you're going to do an update. You do not want to upgrade a broken system. Make sure there's no stale partitions, missing disks or paths, anything like that you want to fix first. Make sure that your paths are redundant. What you should be seeing is when you're rebooting one VIO, half the paths to your client should disappear. That shouldn't cause you a problem. If all the paths to your client disappear, then somebody has not done their zoning correctly, and that's a major issue. As I said, I always run HMC scanner or sysplan to document things. I take my backup. I keep all my backup update images on an NFS file system, but if I'm doing an upgrade like this, I copy the files locally. So I will copy the mksysb image that I'm going to use for the upgrade into a directory that I call /user-localsoft, and that's where my upgrade will be done from. My concern about doing it across the network with NFS is I don't want to be in the middle of an update and have the network go down on me. I've actually had it happen where I lost my VPN access and I had to actually do a full restore, which fortunately I'd taken a clone before I started. I've mentioned SSPs and how there's specific additional steps. Once you upgrade and reboot your first VIO, before you start on the second VIO server, you need to make sure that all of the paths came back on all of your clients before you start working on the second one. You don't want to start working on the second one and find that not all the paths were back and you just trashed one of your production L paths. And I tend to find that they come back very quickly, but there have been times when people have said that they've taken 30 to 40 minutes to come back. So you do need to pay attention to that. Some additional things to be aware of. Going from version 2 to version 3 is an upgrade. It is not an update. You cannot use update iOS. I already talked about most of the things in this slide, but I will say that one of the things that I do is I create a file called filestosave.txt in /home/padmin. And in that is a list of critical files that I want to have saved. What that does is it actually copies those files across to a backup directory in /home/padmin on the new clone. Now, reality is I could just wake up the old system and copy them myself, but this does it for me, and I know that they're going to be saved. I do my backups, I do my steps if I've got SSPs, run the upgrade, and then at the end of the upgrade, it'll come up, you'll log in, you'll change your password, you'll run a command, and it will then reboot on you again. And when it does that reboot, it's actually restoring all the metadata and putting all your virtual things back in. And then you basically have to do any customizations that you would normally do on a VIO server, etc. So here's where we get the mksysb image off the ISO, and we do the loop mount with the UDFS. We then copy that mksysb image to wherever you want to copy it. In my case, I copied it to user-localsoft, and I called it VIOS 31125 flash mksysb image, and that's the one I plan to use for the upgrade. Now, I also at the same time download any IO adapter updates and the latest Java and SSH and SSL updates, but I don't put those on my VIO server yet because when I do the upgrade, it's just going to delete them anyway. This is typical of what I have in my filestosave.txt. It's the environment, you'll see it's resolve.conf, you'll see my NTP configurations. One thing to be aware of is these files have to exist. If they don't exist, when you run your upgrade, it's going to come back and tell you they don't exist and it's going to stop. Good news is you go back, either touch the file or remove it from this file, and then you can just restart the upgrade. So in order to do the upgrade, I've said you have to have a spare disk. Well, if I run lspv, and you can see I've got my file backed optical mirrored, I have my root VG, and I have an alt-inst root VG. So the first thing is alt-inst root VG cannot exist when I'm doing the upgrade, because the first thing it does is it takes an alt disk copy. When I look at my disks, and as PadMin you can run lspv-size, I can see that HDisk3 and HDisk1 are the same size, so I can already tell they're both my root VGs. But now I want to look for unused or free disks, and of course there are none. So one of the things that I have to do is free up the disk. Now the first time I did this, I wasn't aware of the alt-inst root VG issue, so I ran my VIOS upgrade, and it actually came up and said to me, the disk you're telling me to use is in use, go away. Then I went back and I basically exported my alt-inst root VG. You have the option of importing it to another, with a different name. If you had a different free disk and you were just trying to free up alt-inst root VG, you can rename it. In my case, I just export it and delete, which deletes it. You should be using alt root VG op rather than export VG for this, but either of them does the job. Now when I run lspv, I can see that HDisk3 is free. But just because it shows as not being in a volume group doesn't mean it's free. One of the things you need to do is clear the owning volume manager from the disk. When you run lspv-free, if it still shows no disks free, then you're going to run the PV-C against the disk, and since there was a boot image on it, you should clear that as well. Now we see HDisk3 has not in a volume group, and when I run lspv-3, now I can see that that disk is actually free and available to use. Now we can finally look at doing our upgrade. Make sure that you're at VIO server 2.2.6.32 at a minimum. Some people went higher than that and they had some issues because the alternate disk copy was at a different level to what the VIO server image they were downloading was at. I've found that from 226.32 I'm extremely successful. I keep a copy of 226.32 around to update things to before I go to 3.11.25. I run my update iOS commit. I go into root and I run emanager, make sure there's no efixes. I do tend to put efixes and ifixes on my VIO servers because I don't like having security holes, and a lot of them fix those kind of things, as well as some of the issues with I/O adapters, etc. So we're getting to the point where we can do our upgrade. So what does that VIOS upgrade on the VIO server do? First thing it does is it takes a configuration backup for you. Then it builds the VIO server on the new disk. Then it migrates the configuration, it sets the boot list, and it reboots. And it tells you you've got 60 seconds and then I'm going to reboot. And you can at that point stop it. The actual syntax I use is the VIOS upgrade -L, and then the -I is where I point to the mksysb image that I want it to use to build my VIO server. The -A is telling it to go to HDisk3, and the -G is telling it, by the way, I want you to save all the files that I mention in my filestosave.txt and copy them to my new root VG in /home/padmin, and I think it's a backups directory. Okay, so the second time I tried this, my upgrade failed. And my upgrade failed because I had used the 2 DVD set and I had messed up the concatenation of the images. So I got these really weird unpacking error messages. Once I figured out what that was, I went back and I redid the upgrade. And in this time, the upgrade worked. You can see that it says welcome to the tool. It goes through, it basically takes a VIOS-BR backup. It then goes through and does its alt disk copy, and it does its install, unmounts everything, and then you get the message saying, I'm going to reboot in 60 seconds. And you have a choice of hitting Control-C to terminate or just letting it go through. So this particular time I had actually hit Control-C because I wanted to see what happened. And I went and I checked what was going on with the upgrade, with the VIOS upgrade -L-Q. I checked my backups and everything else because I wasn't quite ready to do this upgrade yet. I was just doing a test run. I actually completely redid the update again after exporting alternate root GG, etc. And this time I let it actually reboot. So after the reboot, it did at least 2 reboots. Now you have a choice. In my case, I'm not very patient, so I immediately logged in as padmin. I accepted the license after I set my password. You will have to reset your password as part of this. And then I ran the VIOS upgrade -L-Q. It basically almost immediately did a reboot because what it was doing, and you can see this here, is it was going to do a restore. So it said license acceptance is successful, restoring the backup, got a bunch more messages, and then it rebooted. And sometimes it'll reboot once, sometimes it will reboot twice. Then after the upgrade, I log in and I do my iOS level, my OS level -S. I always run infix to check that there's no missing file sets. And now it's time for me to make the customizations that I would normally make. I tend to add a separate logging file system. I fix paging, Etsy environment, those kind of things. And any tunables that you had run for virtual Ethernets, any tuning that you had done of the I/O adapters, any of those kind of things, you will need to rerun all of those. This is basically a fresh install that restores your virtual definitions. Some of the things that I do after the upgrade is, as I mentioned, I fix the page spaces because I'm going to get that 512 meg page space and a 1 gig page space. And I don't like that, particularly not when it's on the same LUN. So I get rid of paging 00 and I make HD6 at least 4 gig. If you didn't grade to the latest VIO server, then you're going to do the upgrade. In this case, it's 3.11.25. And then if you're keeping Java 7, then you want to upgrade it to the latest Java. And as of September, that was .670. You want to make sure you update your Java 8. And you want to update your SSL and SSH. I've actually more recently been installing version 8 of SSH. They do a lot to tighten up security, so it's always recommended before you update SSH that you save your etc ssh sshd config. Now, I do those using update iOS. I copy all the file sets I need for Java 7 or Java 8, SSL and SSH into a directory, run inutoc, and then I use update iOS and point to those. As of September 14th, these were the highest patch levels for the Java's SSL and SSH version 7. So we obtain SSH and SSL from the web download pack. That has moved, so I've got the link in here for you. And that link was working as of yesterday, which was October 3rd. You untar the files and you put them all into a directory, which I usually use /user localsoft Java SSH SSL. You run update iOS commit, and then you point update iOS at that directory and tell it to install. Then you can do your LSLPPs and check that everything's there. You will need Java 8.sdk and Java 8_64.sdk once you're at 3.11.25. I actually remove Java 6 if it's on, and as of 3.10.21, you can remove Java 7 if you want. The other thing I look for is security patches, so I will download FlirtVC and I will run it to see if there are any security patches that need to go on. As of early October, there was only one patch that needed to go on the VIO server once it's at 3.11.25, and that patch is known as bindfix 17, and it is a patch to DNS that you can put on with eManager. So eManager you have to run as root, but I do use eManager and I do put patches on all the time. And this is where you get the patch. Once you download the patch and untar everything, I grep the .asc file to find what the 3.11.25 patch name is. In this case, it's IG25927S2A. And then I'll use eManager to install it. If you need to remove an efix, then the way to do it is with eManager-R. And other than that, there were no other patches to go on. Something else you want to make sure that you do is that you set your NTP servers up to actually make sure that your dates are correct. It's important to have your VIO servers synced on date. Otherwise, things can get out of sync and it can cause you problems. It can also cause you issues with the HMC and RMC. So I normally edit both ntp.conf and the one that it really uses, which is homeadmin-config ntp.conf. In this case, I'm using the atomic NTP servers. As long as you can resolve those names, do an NS lookup before you try this, then you should be able to use them. If you have your own internal NTP servers, then put those in there after the word server. And then I run NTP date against those NTP servers, and I start NTP. I can do, and I also make sure that I go into etc rc-tcp/ip and uncomment xntpd so that it will start at boot time. One of the other things I do is I have a script that I always put in etc-tunables called rc-tunevio.sh, and this script makes a few changes that I find to be helpful. One is it sets my network tunables so that I've got some specific buffer space because the defaults are just too low. I also set min-free and max-free so that I have 1024 pages in between when it would start to steal pages and when it would go into page thrashing. I don't ever want to take advantage of those, but I like to have that gap just a little bit bigger. And then I also tune my fiber adapters for the VIO servers so that they can provide better performance and they can have more throughput. The numbers that you use for num command alums are going to range from 1024 to 4096 depending on what your storage subsystem supports. So that's something that you should be checking. I also tune my virtual buffers. One of the things I like to do is to make sure that I have at least a slight difference between what the maximums and minimums are. And one of the reasons I want to do that is because I want to see if I have a problem. If I'm running out of virtual buffers, I want to know. By default, the mode will be set to max min, which means it doesn't matter what you put. It will always make sure that you have the maximum buffers. The problem with that is then you don't know if you have a problem. because it's always going to show max allocated equal to maximum, even if you're not using them. In terms of post-install checks, I always run iOS level. I go in and I run OS level -SQ to check for the known service packs. I run OS level -S, and then I actually run OS level -S against the highest service pack to make sure that there's nothing there. And I do my Efixes. I just like to double check that everything matches. I run LPP check -V and VM3 and obviously ERRPT. Once all the checks are passed and the VIOs back up, and when I say VIO2, I always do the backup VIO first, which is typically VIO2, but you need to know that. You need to check your client LPARs. If they're seeing all their paths and they've had no network problems, then you can go do the same upgrade to VIO1. Now, one of the other things I do is I go into inetd.conf after saving a copy, and I actually remove everything out of it that I don't want to be using, so that my inetd.conf is about 5 lines. One of the reasons I do that is because although you go through and you comment out things because they're security holes, if you do a maintenance run and you've got 162 or whatever it is lines in there and it uncomments something, you won't know. But if you've only got 5 lines in there, you're going to know immediately after an upgrade that something got put back. When I'm done, if I'm on internal disk and I'm happy, then I will remirror my root VG. And obviously you take a backup of both VIO servers when you're done, and those backups are now smaller. I really noticed it when I was doing my NIM backups. If you have problems, there's a number of log files, and that's what I'm pointing to here is the places you can go to find your logs. What happens if you have problems? Well, I had some very strange problems when I was upgrading to 226.32. I haven't had them when I've been going to version 3. Things like I'll do an OS level -S and it'll show 6.1 with the wrong values, or 7.2 with the wrong, well, it won't show 7.2 at this point, but 6.1. And if I do an infix, I find some missing file sets. I always go and find those file sets, and one of the reasons I would do that is because I found that these things get worse over time, and I actually ended up working on a VIO server one time that had about 300 or 400 missing file sets. I can't even believe it stayed up. So I like to actually fix this, and what I would typically do to fix it is I find out what the missing file sets are. So ADDE is pretty common at 226.32. If I see the ADDE stuff on 226.32, I don't bother fixing it nowadays because I'm going to 3.11.25 in the next week, so I leave it. But if I see stuff in there that concerns me, then I will fix it. And the way that you fix it, you can either remove it using update ios-remove, or you can find the missing file sets and put them in their own directory. Don't put anything else in there, just the stuff you have to put on, and you can use update iOS to actually say, I want you to put these on. At some point with version 3.1, we'll probably end up having to do this. Right now, 3.11.25 is a very, very clean install. Finally, a couple of notes that I think are important for you. There are some issues with I/O adapters, so you do need to update some of your I/O adapter firmware ahead of time. And I have some notes here on how to do that. And if you are doing it on your SEA, if you have to update your SEA and you have an Ether channel, then what you're going to have to do is ifconfig them down and detach them, rmdev them, run the diag command, get all the Ethernet ports updated, and then run config manager. You may need to ifconfig them back up, although I didn't need to, and everything should be working. And as I said, when you're working on the primary, you want to switch it to a standby mode, and then afterwards switch it back to auto. I want to thank you for attending. Please take the time to fill in the evaluation form. We do read those, and we find those comments to be very helpful. And if you have any questions, you're very welcome to email me, and there will be a copy of the presentation uploaded both through the virtual technical conference, and also I tend to load the PDFs up at my website. So again, thank you, stay safe and stay healthy.